not from your report, because this one will be presented later on and we will have time to listen to different stakeholders, how they look at it. One quotation that came my way and which I would share with you and which made heavy impress on me, and we took it up in the article that the new GFAR chair and I as executive secretary are currently publishing with our vision for GFAR in the future. So this is the quotation: small farmers account for 84% of all farms worldwide. So they are super important. But they operate only around 12% of all agricultural land. And by doing so, they produce 35% of the world's food, which is amazing. At the other end of the scale, we have to acknowledge that there is an increased concentration of farmland. And the largest 1% of farms of the world operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. I think this is very telling. And with this, I would like to hand the floor, I guess, back to Natalie and to Don, and then to colleagues presenting the report and to you to discuss. I think it is a very important issue to discuss. And I also think if I look at the recommendations of the report, the 4 recommendations, that GFAR is well placed to help following up on these. So over to you. I wish you very fruitful discussions. I have to apologize that latest when you will move into a workout in the breakout rooms, I will have to leave because I have a clashing meeting with a potential funder. And in order to help us doing collective actions, I have to also make sure that we have proper funding for these. To at least provide you, have the expertise with Valeria today, or the facilitating support with Natalie today, and maybe also some seed funding or whatever might be needed. So apologize if I have to leave at some point of time, but I will follow up on what you discussed, and Don and I will sit together with Valeria and Natalie and see what will be the next steps. Thank you so much. All the very best. I look forward to hearing and discussing with you.
Thank you, Hildegard. Appreciate having these statistics. I know that we have many experts here who are well aware, but when you have these numbers, it's quite striking, and it really puts the importance on this topic. And so I'll hand it over to you, Don, for some words of opening here. And welcome to those that are just joining us. We understand sometimes connections are hard, so happy that you are here. Over to you, Don.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks again, Hildegard, for those encouraging words. Again, a pleasant good afternoon to all of us. Let me thank the Global Forum for Agricultural Research for co-organizing this webinar with ANGOC. We would like to extend our appreciation as well to the Global Land Tool Network for the support provided us in this learning exchange, which is part of a series of webinars that complements the ongoing initiative on consolidating the application of innovative land tools for promoting the land rights of smallholder farmers. Land tenure is particularly important in Asia, a region most prone to natural disasters and the impact of climate change. The region is also home to the world poorest, who depend on land for their life and livelihoods. Unfortunately, poor people are often left out of the climate change discussions. Among the poor, those without land or near landless are the most marginalized and voiceless, and thus land tenure issues are rarely addressed or tackled. They are often treated as causes and passive victims rather than as potential active responders in the fight against climate change. And while there has been an increasing recognition of tenure security as a factor that increases the resiliency of people to the effects of climate change, literature and evidence are still limited. And the link of tenure and climate change needs to be further studied, illustrated, and establish. It is in this context that ANGOC and our members in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Philippines, and our partner in Kyrgyzstan prepared a paper, No Time to Waste, Climate Action Through Secure Land Rights and Sustainable Land Use. Supported by the International Land Coalition, this paper seeks to train the spotlight on the specific issues of land tenure, land use, and climate change, and on how these are intertwined. But let me say that the study is not an academic paper, but rather a descriptive paper that draws mainly from secondary sources prepared from various civil society organization, field experiences, and secondary sources. The paper and the case studies presented there in simple narratives is an attempt to further humanize the discourse of climate change with the land rights perspective. The study also builds from two earlier studies on tenure and climate change conducted by ANGOC with the support of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the Global Landfill Network. And given the increasing recognition to traditional knowledge and practices for ecological preservation and restoration, it also becomes imperative and timely that we initiate discussion in improving their tenure along the discourse of climate change mitigation. Thus, this webinar contributes to the ongoing efforts to support public awareness and advocacy on the need to address land tenure rights in climate responses, as well as explore ideas to put into action the key recommendations of the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for positioning this this paper. I had an opportunity to look at it. I hope that you have too. And if you have not, you have the link in the invitation. It is very thorough and very well written for someone who is not an expert in this. I really appreciated it. And so to help us get a sense of this paper, we have Tony Cuizon, who's going to present the highlights. And so after this, we'll have an opportunity to speak with a panel and ask them some key questions. And then we will, all of us will have a chance to discuss this in breakout rooms. So it was very important for us that we have time to hear your reactions, discuss this topic, and see how together we could create some movement around this very important topic. And so, Tony, I will hand it over to you. And if you would like to share your screen and your presentation, you're welcome to do so now. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you. Don?
Yeah, before Tony presents the before Tony presents the paper, we will show first a video of this study, and then Tony will proceed with the PowerPoint. Tony used to be is the former executive director and chairperson of the Asian NGO Coalition, and has written a number of studies on land rights and food security and smallholder agriculture. Okay, so we'll show first the video. Marian will share the screen, and then Tony will proceed with the PowerPoint.
The impacts that climate
We drop the sound for the moment.
people's land access and land
Good. Oh.
the
I'm just going to,
However,
there we go.
impacts that climate change brings upon human settlements and land use systems can bear heavily on people's land access and land tenure in ways that affect their livelihoods, well-being, and sense of security. However, even with a growing awareness on climate change, there is still limited understanding and response in addressing the nexus of the impacts of climate change, social and policy responses, and need for land tenure security. For one, the links between land tenure and climate change may not be obvious. Tenure has traditionally been viewed from the perspective of an individual, family, or community. Climate change, on the other hand, is often viewed from a global perspective and is attributed to the collective or human use or abuse of natural resources. Also, much of climate change discussions remain under the exclusive realm of scientists and governments. Meanwhile, poor people are often left out of climate change discussions. Among the poor, those without land or near landless are the most marginalized and voiceless, and thus land tenure issues are rarely addressed or tackled. The linkages between climate change and land tenure are multiple, complex, and indirect. Land rights may be held individually or collectively in a family, a group, or a community, or by the state. Land tenure, on the other hand, refers to the way in which interests in land are held by people or entities, such as the state. Land tenure rights, therefore, influence the way that land and natural resources are used and can impact directly on the environment and on climate change. Inappropriate land development can lead to massive deforestation, siltation of rivers, and toxicity of the soils. During disasters, the poor and the tenure insecure are at higher risk of experiencing the adverse effects of these extreme climatic events. Not only that poverty, coupled with land degradation, reduces the resiliency of communities to the effects of climate change, the lack of tenure security limits people's choices and diminishes their capacity to recover and rebuild from a natural disaster. In the state of Kerala, India, an unprecedented amount of rainfall in August 2018 caused widespread flooding and landslides that left 400 dead and 5.4 million people affected, covering 1/6 of the state's population. Land use changes brought about by urbanization and overdevelopment was seen by local people as the major reason for the disaster. In Bangladesh, over 1 million people are displaced each year due to river flooding and riverbank erosion brought by the annual monsoons, and this is likely to become more significant under climate change as rainfall both increases and becomes more erratic, and the melting Himalayan glaciers alter river flows. Land systems create vulnerability to disasters. Many poor families are often forced to live in areas that are vulnerable to flooding, high tides or storm surges, landslides, and erosion. Others are compelled to make a living in harsh environments that are too dry, too steep, or too remote, with lack of access to basic services. The lack of tenure security further reduces the incentives and capacity for the people to invest in housing improvements or to modify their living environments to protect their homes against floods, landslides, and disasters. A case in point is when Typhoon Washi hit northern Mindanao, Philippines in December 2011. Heavy rainfall in the highlands caused flash floods and landslides that sent mud and logs crashing down on poor communities near the river, mountain, and sea, where over 1,000 people were immediately killed overnight. Those living near riverbanks and low-lying areas were most affected. Natural disasters impact on land and human relationships on land. Some natural disasters such as erosion, landslides, flooding, and salinization indirectly result in significant loss of land, leading to loss of livelihoods, destruction of homes, and displacement of populations. In most cases, the poor and vulnerable are forced to fend for themselves when a natural disaster strikes. Rural families may be pushed to migrate to areas where their tenure rights may not be recognized. The story of 50 families displaced by floods and landslides and now living in Bategada village in Nepal shows how climate change pushes communities at risks to the farthest margin of economic development. Calamities also cause displacement indirectly, as land is submerged, landmarks are erased, known boundaries disappear, and legal documents are destroyed, thereby causing local land disputes or even creating opportunities for secondary land occupation and land grabs. Typhoon Haiyan that hit the Philippines in 2013 was among the strongest tropical cyclones to hit land in recorded history. In the aftermath of the storm, coconut tenant farmers in the coastal towns of Guian and Kinapondan, Eastern Samar, were evicted by their landowners as they were unable to pay their lease rentals after the typhoon had damaged their crops. Some landowners began to sell the land without the knowledge of their tenants. Reports of developers grabbing abandoned land were also widespread. Land responses affect resilience after natural disasters. In many countries, humanitarian efforts aimed at reducing disaster risk and responding post-disaster have not adequately dealt with land tenure rights and property issues. Inadequate responses appear to be caused in part by a lack of clear understanding of tenure issues in the context of natural disasters, the lack of clear policy, the lack of allocated resources, and the limited capacity of frontline responders to deal with tenure issues. Land tenure security is crucial for climate change adaptation and disaster prevention. When there is tenure security, families invest better in their homes and farms. Secure land tenure enhances resiliency as it contributes to, among others, improved food and water security, more sustainable livelihoods, reduced forest and unplanned human mobility that leads to landlessness, reduced environmental degradation, and reduced conflict over land and resources. Land tenure security is a key factor that encourages people to protect and sustainably manage larger landscapes and forests on which their homes and livelihoods depend. A common example is the establishment of community forests, where communities are given user rights to forests. In turn, the families protect and manage forests from where they draw their household needs and livelihoods. In Cambodia, one such case is the establishment of the Rokha Community Forestry in Pursat Province, which also enabled forest dwellers participate in the commune's climate change adaptation and mitigation action planning. Tenure security also fosters decentralization of natural resource management as a result of increased participation and empowerment of community members themselves, and not only of local leaders and elites. In Kyrgyzstan, communities of user groups play a central role in the planning and management of the country's pasture, forest, and water resources. They are seen as key players in the rapid response to and prevention of natural disasters from climate change. The functioning of these user associations is enshrined in national laws of the Kyrgyz Republic, which increases the ability of the poor to adapt to climate change and to contribute to its mitigation. In Bukidnon, Philippines, the recognition of land rights of the Talandig tribe through a Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title or CADT has empowered the indigenous community to govern and protect its land and forests. In a span of 11 years, the forest cover of the ancestral domain increased from 45.8% in 2005 to 49.8% in 2016. Further, the recognition of their CADT enabled the tribe
We have the screen is frozen.
to negotiate confidently with different stakeholders in the design and establishment of the Payment for Ecosystem Services or PES. Also, securing tenure rights of women is key for their social and economic well-being and in climate change adaptation. Women's empowerment is crucial in challenging existing power relations, cultural practices, knowledge systems, and adaptive strategies in ways that can improve protection of the environment and overall resilience to natural disasters. In an earlier Resolution 7 of 23, the Human Rights Council had stated that climate change poses an immediate and far-reaching threat to people and communities around the world, and climate change has implications for the full enjoyment of human rights. Human rights principles enable resilience practices to have a greater pro-poor emphasis by changing the balance of power in favor of the marginalized. This includes addressing the needs of those who are in the front lines of the impacts of climate change, including peasants, indigenous peoples, pastoralists, small farmers, fisherfolk, and poor urban dwellers. People in vulnerable situations who face greater risks and threats from climate change should have the right to meaningful and informed participation in decisions likely to affect their rights and survival. In adaptation, there is wide consensus that states should ensure adequate tenure security for people and communities, as this provides a starting point and enabling environment for people to cope with climate change and to take adaptive responses. A rights-based approach would compel states and other duty bearers to address land tenure issues and to re-establish tenure security for affected families and communities in the event of climate-induced disasters. However, land tenure is not addressed in several international instruments on climate change and natural disasters. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework do not provide explicit references to tenurial rights. Instead, the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of lands, fisheries, and forests is one of the few international documents that expressly mentions the linkages of land tenure rights to climate change, natural disasters, and conflict. Further, the UN Social Development Goals, or SDGs, specifically recognize the role of land in sustaining human development, community land rights, and climate action. Currently, the laws on climate change and natural disasters still do not address land tenure issues. On the other end, neither do existing land laws make sufficient reference to climate change and disasters. Inadequate responses to disaster events often stem from a lack of clear understanding of tenure issues in the context of natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. Thus, it is important that land tenure issues be addressed in early efforts at building resilience and disaster preparedness. Also, climate change adaptation needs to be mainstreamed into national planning and policy frameworks, including land policy. Specifically, the main recommendations for CSOs and governments are first, to build a better understanding and appreciation of land tenure issues in climate change discussions. Second, ensure inclusive governance and address the need to reframe the policy discourse on climate change. Third, address land tenure rights and security in the context of natural disasters by including land tenure concerns in vulnerability assessment, relief and rehabilitation programs, disaster mapping, and by providing means to resolve disputes over local tenure rights. And fourth, ensure and engage stakeholders' participation in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of policy instruments for land-based climate change adaptation and mitigation, and in the co-designing of resilience action.
A very powerful and very powerful video. It's amazing when you see images, how striking it is. And so, Tony, over to you to further add to this.
Thank you. Can you see it?
Tony. Yes, we can see
Okay,
it. Thank you.
Sorry. Good afternoon, good morning. My role is just to provide is to go through the different ideas and go through the different themes after that video presentation and try to understand better the links between land tenure, vulnerability, and climate-led disasters. The presentation will go like this, looking into the global context and local realities, Asian context, the problems that when disasters actually strike, and the problem of addressing land tenure rights in mitigation and adaptation, and examining the rights-based approach and looking into ways forward. In the report, there was a recent report which I thought is important to point out here, which looks into climate change and land, published by the IPCC in 2019. It said there are 3 points that struck me on the report regarding land. One is that land is both a source and sink of greenhouse gases, and therefore you need sustainable land management. Second is that people currently use about 1/3 of the land's potential for food, feed, fiber, timber, and energy, and that and it provides a lot of ecosystem functions and services, which is not only physical but also cultural, and also the regulatory services, including things like floods or the water table. The terrestrial system or the land system is equivalent to the value of the annual global GDP. Agriculture, which is heavily affected, currently accounts for 70% of global freshwater use. This is what the video mentioned, the local reality. While we say that climate change affects everyone, it is actually the poor and those who lack land rights who are the most vulnerable. They are the first victims, and they are also the last people to recover. And when disaster strikes, people lose their homes and assets. This limits the capacity of people to recover their choices. And what happens is a vicious cycle of sinking deeper into poverty. And yet the link between poverty, land tenure rights, and climate change is still not very well appreciated. In much of the literature, what is very clear is the link between land use and sustainability, or land use and climate change. And yet, land use is determined by tenure, because those who make the decisions are those people having the rights. It should be fairly obvious, but it is not often excluded in a lot of the discussions. There is a need to look at climate change issues from below, and maybe with a different lens. There is a quote that says, one main failing in climate diplomacy or discussions is that the phenomenon has often been viewed as a scientific projection or a scientific problem. It's like a kind of a graph stretching into the future with abstract measurements. We need to translate this scientific consensus and bring down the discussion into a vision of how the consequences of global warming are felt by people and communities around the world. In other words, we need to humanize climate change and the climate change discourse. This was in the Asian context. This is the links between land tenure, resource use, and climate change. Globally, Asia and the Pacific have the highest frequency and magnitude of extreme weather events. 72% of the intense natural disasters between 1971 to 2010. Also, 6 of the 10 most hit countries by extreme climate events are in Asia. But it's not only the vulnerability, it's not only the natural disasters, but the vulnerability which impacts on people. Because of the high proportion of people living with insecure tenure, it reduces resiliency to the effects of disasters. Poverty and the lack of tenure security heightens the risks of people to the effects of natural disasters and climate change. There is one study here that says that Japan and the Philippines, for example, are hit by the same number of typhoons each year. But a cyclone or a typhoon of the same intensity would kill 17 times more Filipinos due to the country's greater level of vulnerability, including poor standards of housing and infrastructure, and the large number of people settled in at-risk areas. Agriculture is the most vulnerable. Poverty remains largely rural and agricultural. 70% of the world's indigenous peoples, 87% of the world's small farms. Drought is the main disaster stressor for crops and livestock at the global levels. In Asia, the biggest impacts come from floods and landslides. When disasters strike, there are a lot of land issues in vulnerability and resiliency. So sectors that have no security of tenure, who are politically weak, face the greatest risk to the impacts of climate change and natural disasters. Sometimes people have no choice, and even though they live in high-risk areas, they are willing to take the risk because they need to be close to their livelihoods. Poverty itself pushes people to live under vulnerable areas and under highly dangerous conditions. In terms of when disasters strike, there can be erosion, landslides, flooding, salinization that can directly result in a significant loss of land. People may be forced to migrate. Sometimes the displacement is temporary. Sometimes it is permanent. And sometimes when people are forced to migrate, then they come into rising competition within their new spaces or in their areas of resettlement. When people return to their homes, there are local land disputes. There's land speculation and land grabs. And I think some of the examples were presented. The holders of secondary rights, tenants, sharecroppers, pastoralists, and those who lease or occupy land become vulnerable to eviction. In the Philippines, for example, after some of the major hurricanes and some of the major floods, when the crops are destroyed, landowners would say that they have no more tenancy relationships with their tenants, and the tenants no longer have the rights because there are no crops to talk about because all the crops have already been destroyed. So the holders of secondary rights become highly vulnerable to eviction. And affected families with no documented rights often have greater difficulty in relocating or reclaiming their original occupied properties. In some of our experiences, it is not just land documents that you lose. You also lose your marriage certificate, you lose your identity card, you have to prove your existence and that you're a victim. And this is what happens when people have no secure tenure and when they lose all their documentation. We talked about women as being especially vulnerable, especially when in cases where the male relative dies or it gets lost, no? And the land is registered in the male's name. And also we had experiences where people without secure tenure lose out on permanent shelter assistance. There were specific examples where there were both NGOs and government were going around some of the devastated areas. But those people who could not show that they were tenured or that they had tenure rights were not given housing materials, for example, to rebuild their homes. Indeed, the lack of tenure security limits people's choices and diminishes their capacity to recover and to rebuild from a disaster. It's also harder to resume their livelihoods especially when they are displaced from their areas of work and businesses. Conflicts intensify over land. Therefore, land tenure rights are important in climate change adaptation and mitigation. Oftentimes, the discussions are very technical, but they don't look into who are the decision makers and are the landless part of the discussion. When tenure is secure, families invest better in their homes and their farms. They can build embankments, terraces, dikes, and drainage system that lessen exposure to damage and risks. They have wider options and choices, farming systems, irrigation, inputs, choice of crops when to plant. It improves their risk management decisions and also access to government services. When adaptation is done at an individual or family level, you need some level of negotiation and education and organization. And what happens usually is that you have a patchwork of individual decisions negotiated across a whole landscape. But that is a necessary approach in many instances where you have to negotiate with your neighbor where you will put the canal, where the flood waters will drain out, and all of that. Therefore, there have been several emerging approaches like community-based resource management, indigenous community conservation areas, and even earlier it was mentioned community forestry, as in the case of Cambodia. One of the case examples mentioned was the Mount Kalatungan in Bukidnon, Philippines, in terms of the payment for ecosystem services. You saw the video of the destruction of houses when a strong typhoon hit northern Mindanao. What happened after that event in 2011 was that the people downstream began to negotiate with the indigenous peoples upstream for the preservation and the reforestation of the watershed. So there you had a payment for ecosystem services where the indigenous peoples became the seller and the downstream beneficiaries like businesses, cooperatives, and organizations and households became the buyers of that services. I'd like to introduce maybe just a few points also raised in the 2019 IPCC report. I think the main statement in terms of the link between climate change and tenure security is this. It says that insecure land tenure affects the ability of people, communities, and organizations to make changes to land that can advance adaptation and mitigation. And therefore, you need a whole range of land policies that can provide security and flexibility in terms of responses to climate change. The 900-page report mentions land tenure in about 90 paragraphs, but there are two specific sections on land tenure. One is under 3.6 in terms of land tenure security in response to desertification. It says that land tenure security contributes to the adoption of soil conservation measures in croplands, leads to greater investment in trees, can lead to higher productivity, agricultural productivity and incomes, and also increased investments in sustainable land management. On the other hand, the privatization, for example, of rangelands among pastoralists has led to the loss of communal grazing lands and has actually increased the degradation of rangelands. So you need the appropriate type of tenure reforms. There is need also to address land tenure in governance under section 7.6. It says that as much as 65% of the world's total land area is managed under local, customary, or communal tenure systems, but only about 15% of this is formally recognized by government, estimated at about 521 million hectares of forest land in 2017. Much of the world's carbon is stored in the biomass and soil of the territories of customary landowners, including indigenous peoples, and therefore securing these land tenure regimes is vital in land and climate protection. And for smallholder systems, customary tenure can provide necessary long-term security for long-term investments in farm fertility, such as tree planting. There is also strong empirical evidence on the links between secure communal tenure and lower deforestation rates. Finally, that land tenure under climate change must take into account large-scale land acquisitions or land grabbing in developing countries. As of 2016, it's estimated that about 42.2 million hectares worldwide. We need a rights-based approach to climate change. As the UNHCR mentioned in 2021, while climate change affects people everywhere, those who have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions are those who are most affected. Equity in climate actions requires that efforts to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change should benefit people in developing countries, indigenous peoples, people in vulnerable situations, and future generations. So this is the inequality in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. There are also climate impacts on people and land, and it has human rights implications. So this diagram is from Limon in 2009. On the left side, you have 3 types of climate impacts: sea level rise, temperature increase, and extreme weather events that can cause loss of land or food and water insecurity, dislocation of populations. And on the third column, you find the human rights issues or human rights implications of climate change. The right to self-determination, water, the right to culture, right to property, life, means of subsistence, adequate and secure housing, and others. So there are human rights implications of climate impacts. And therefore, there is consensus that states should ensure adequate tenurial security for people and communities. Tenure system should allow land rights to be reassigned to enable societies to cope with land use change, displacement, migration, as well as the impacts of climate change that might also include rising competition and conflict. Climate change should also be addressed in broader land policy. For example, the disposition of public lands. In most Asian countries, public lands cover about between 40 to 60% of the total surface area of the different countries. And therefore, the disposition of that land is crucial in terms of climate change. For example, Indonesia itself, about 50 to 60 million hectares are under state concessions to plantations. There are 4 main recommendations in moving forward: improve the climate change discourse, inclusive governance in order to reframe the policies on climate change as well as the policies on land, address tenure rights and security, especially in the context of natural disasters, and ensure participation in prevention, mitigation, adaptation, planning, assessments, and all. So let me just go quickly through this. One is that we need to change or improve the climate change discourse so that it becomes a concern of everyone, and it's brought down, no longer within the exclusive realm of scientists and policymakers. We must start to humanize climate change discussions in terms of lifestyles, consumption behaviors, inequalities, the kinds of choices we have to make and the sacrifices we have to make. This will create an ethical imperative so that we can act, and we can also translate this into legal obligations. I remember before, even in the discussion in the 1990s, when the whole discussion about environment came up, it started as something that was beyond individual people until people started, some of the concerned groups and environmentalists started to say, we have to talk about environment as a one-person obligation. So is there a one-person is there a one-person approach to restoring and protecting the environment? Similarly, we should talk about bringing the issue of climate change to individual choices. The other also, in using a human rights lens, we have to amplify the voices of the poor and marginalized so that they can be heard. The other will be to improve the documentation of field cases and also to create alternative experience. Two, we need inclusive governance, and we need to reframe policies on climate change and also in terms of land policies. We need to review national policies and adopt national frameworks. There are two references, but maybe there could be more. One is the VGGT and the other are the SDGs. We need to undertake comprehensive land use planning guided by scientific hazard mapping in adaptation and disaster preparedness, in nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, include clear commitments on tenure of vulnerable communities, ensure a gender perspective in the planning for all climate change mitigation and adaptation, build transparent and accessible land administration systems that can contribute to risk reduction and recovery. And in building disaster preparedness and resilience, we need to start to address broader development goals of ensuring greater land equity, redistribution, and tenure security. In promoting climate responsive policies, support customary approaches. We have to start recording land tenure of those living in informal settlements. We can also use mitigation programs to improve tenure security. This could include, for example, community forestry. 3, address tenure rights and security when disasters actually occur. Include land tenure in vulnerability and risk assessments and in adaptation planning. Address tenure in disaster prevention and preparedness programs, and also that they are addressed in relief and rehabilitation programs, because I have also seen many cases where people are relocated to places that are also highly risky and vulnerable to a second disaster. Maybe I'll just go quickly through this. Community mapping can serve as a first step in the planning process when people develop their own mapping systems. The VGGT says that we should assist persons to return to their place of origins with, as a matter of principle, with the means to resolve disputes over local tenure rights. But where people are unable to return to their places of origin, they need to be resettled. Develop post-disaster reconstruction systems, an inventory of potential relocation areas, determine what are the acceptable alternatives to documents as proof of land ownership or occupancy. Conduct community-based enumerations immediately after a disaster. Finally, we need to ensure participation of all local stakeholders, especially the vulnerable groups, in the selection, evaluation, implementation, and monitoring of policy instruments for climate change adaptation and mitigation. We should include those without legally documented property rights, and they should not be excluded from the discussions. Provide mechanisms to actively address land use that leads to land degradation and overexploitation of land and water resources. Adaptation and mitigation plans should be publicly available, transparently financed, and developed in consultation with all affected groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for this great summary. It really helps us to dial in as to what are the next steps. And before we go to our panel, I have a polling question just to get a sense of where our audience here in the webinar are positioning themselves around agreement or support for the linkage of land rights to sustainable land use. I'm going to launch a poll. It's a confidential poll. It's just to get a sense of where your position is. So I will just launch this. So we just want to know, do you see the linkages? Do you agree? Do you need more information? As Don mentioned, although this is not an academic paper, it is certainly backed by many cases and a strong case. So let's see, we have 77% participation. I'll just give a moment more. %. All right, so we've got majority of folks are in agreement, and a few need more information. And so in this desire for more information, we will now move to a video from Datu Minyo, who is an indigenous farmer from the Philippines. And so let us get even more testimonial and information, and then we will go to a panel discussion. So who is running the video?
Marianne.
Very good. Go ahead.
Yung adlaw sa tanan.
If we could run it from the beginning again, because we're not hearing the sound.
Mayong adlaw sa tanan. Dato tumanod Herminyo Ginto sa nagkahiusang manubong manununod sa yutang kabilin dinhi sa bukid sa Kalatungan, lungsod sa pangantukan ning lalawigan sa Bukidnon, dinhi sa pulo sa Mindanao, sa nasod sa Pilipinas. Ang pagpatun sa katungod sa pangyuta, importante gayud kaayo alang sa matag uuma kay kini nasukaranan matag pamilya o katilingban makasugakod sa pagbarog bisan taliwala sa hulga sa kinayanhong katalagman. Maghatag usab kini og dakong kahigayunan nga mapauswag ang kasiguruhan sa pagkaon o malaho tayong tinubdan sa panginabuhian. Dugang paniana kung ang matag mag-uuma maugayod ang tag-iya sa yuta nga iyang gitikan, makahimo siya sa daghang mga pamaagi nga mapanalipdan ang yuta aron dili mabanlas ug dili mudahili kung mulandslide. Sama pananglit sa contour farming, crop rotation, intercropping, pagpananom og mga kahoy, kawayan, abaka, prutas ug kape. Pinaagi niini, malikayan usab ang pagdagsam sa sakit ug dangan sa tanom. Malikayan usab ang siltation ug sedimentation nga maoy hinungdan sa kusog nga pagbahak panahon sa ting-ulan. Gani man, kami ang nagkalain-laing lumadnong hugpungan palibot sa Mount Kalatungan, usa na niini ang nagkahiusang manubong manununod sa yutang kabilin, bisan wala namo madawat ang kadti, nagpadayon kami sa pag-amuma o pagpanalipod sa kinaiyahan pinaagi sa among Indigenous Knowledge System and Practices o ang pagpananom sa kahoy o kape diha sa among yutang kabilin. Kini nga kalihukan usa sa nakadapit sa pagtagad sa ubang mga stakeholders nga motabang ug mosuporta aron mapadayon ang pagpalambo ug pagpanalipod sa kinaiyahan, ang kasiguruhan sa pagpanag-iya sa yuta, ang kasiguruhan sa pagkaon ug malaho tayong tinubdan sa panginabuhian, aron malikayan ang kinaiyanhong katalagman nga bunga sa pagkausab-usab sa klima. Pinaagi sa maalamon ug makugihong paningkamot sa Xavier Science Foundation, ang 7 ka Indigenous Peoples Organization palibot sa Mount Kalatungan nakadawat sa tabang teknikal ug finansyal. Usa na ni ana ang nagkahiusang manubong manununod sa yutang kabilin. Kini kinasingkasing gikan sa funding agency nga mao ang Forest Foundation Philippines. Kini pinaagi sa project nga EcoSeed 2 na establish ang Rainforestation Project sa nagkalain-laing Indigenous Peoples Organization. Usa na usab ni ana ang nagkahiusang manubong manununod sa yutang kabilin, nakatukod usab og mga turukan o tulugan o tribal hall ang mga Indigenous Peoples Organization. Nakahimo usab kami og nursery aron pagpadaghan sa endemic trees og similya sa kape. Pinaagi usab sa Project Resilience sa Minmaf og ang pagpananom sa kape o post-harvest facilities o galingan sa mga kape pinaagi usab sa Philippine Coffee Alliance Incorporated, diin ang Forest Foundation Philippines gihapon ang funder niini. Dugang pagayod ni ana, ang Xavier Science Foundation nagpadayon pagpangita ug pamaagi aron padayong suportahan ang mga Indigenous Peoples Organization diha sa ilang advokasya sa pagpalambo sa kinaiyahan ug ang katungod sa pangyuta. Kamaturan ni ana, ang PES or Payment for Ecosystem Services sa pangantukan Batsuan dinhi sa ancestral domain o yutang kabilin sa nagkahiusang manubong manununod sa yutang kabilin nga nahimutang sa mga sitio San Ginto ug sitio Migbadyang sakop sa barangay Bakusanon ug sitio Balmar sa barangay Nabaliwa, tanan sakop sa pangantukan Bukidnon, Rehiyon 10, Mindanao, Philippines. ug ang tinguha niini mao ang pagpananom og kape nga sin mil kon 1,100 ka punuan kada hektarya ug 566 ka punuang endemic trees matag hektarya diin ang funder niini mao ang One Meralco Foundation o OMF. Daghang salamat o mayong adlaw pag-usab.
Thank you for this video. We're lucky to have Datumino on the webinar. Unfortunately, he has some connection issues. We'll see if his connection gets better. We also were to have a farmer from Nepal, but there are heavy rains that are going on right now. So this is really another example of the difficulty of climate change. So we have a panel to respond to the video and also to share with us how they see this study as being relevant from their perspective for their institution and their network and stakeholders. So we have Romy from Land Portal, the Land Portal group, and we also have Danilo from the Global Land Tool Network. And so I will pin them so that we can see them. And we've got two questions for you, Danilo and Romy. Just give me a moment here. So Danilo, here you are. And if you just give me one moment here, we will add the pin. Here you go. So Romy and Danilo, you are spotlighted right now. And so perhaps you could do a brief introduction of yourselves, and then we will provide you with the first question to respond to. Romy, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Thanks everyone for being here today, and also thanks ANGOC and GFAR for the invitation, particularly to Valeria who has reached out to us. Yeah, it's a great opportunity for us to be here. My name is Romy Sato. I work as the knowledge coordinator in Land Portal, and basically what I am responsible for in the Land Portal is all the part that is about the creation or packaging of knowledge. By knowledge, we mean not scientific studies, but actually how we curate and distill messages and information from scientific studies into a more accessible format. And we have, for example, country profiles about the land governance situation in different countries. We have also briefs about specific land themes, one of them actually being land and climate change. And I also coordinate the part of Land Portal which relates to the data management and the aggregation of data sets, being statistical or spatial, related to land issues. I'll stop here. Thank you.
I noticed that I'm muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Romy. And Danilo, would you like to present yourself?
Yes. Good afternoon to all, and thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. I'm Danilo Antonio. I'm from the Global Land Tool Network, hosted by UN Habitat. I would say I would normally supervise country operations of GLTN, but we also develop a lot of work around tools developed, including on spatial information systems. And I think in particular, and obviously in relation to the discussion today, I also managed to supervise the development of at least one of your key references of the study in terms of land tenure and climate vulnerability, but also in terms of what we call tenure responsive land use planning. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Danilo. So the first question we have for you is, how reflective and relevant is the study? In particular, the importance of land rights in increasing the resiliency of farmers amidst the impact of climate change. So when you see this report, what is your initial reaction to it? Either Romy, yes, go ahead.
Should I go? Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Yeah, so let me start by saying that so Land Portal is not a research or advocacy, for that matter, organization. Even though my position is also as a knowledge coordinator, the way we see our role, what actually is, our realm is knowledge management. So it's really about knowledge about land and how this knowledge is managed. So the way what we do is we try to gather knowledge on land and yes, make this more accessible. Our realm is actually on open data of land information, precisely to try to meet targets such as democratizing the information ecosystem, democratizing information so that the stakeholders, we heard today so much about the need to change the discourse so that local knowledge systems are also enhanced and more heard as the basis for decision-making on climate and tenure security. So this is exactly where we could contribute and how we approach the challenge that are being discussed here today. So I cannot really provide a technical comment on how well the report, of course, deals with the specific tenure issues and the linkages. But I can say that I do see a lot of entry points for Land Portal to be able to collaborate here and try to make precisely this knowledge and the effort of changing the discourse achievable.
Great. So it's more of a vehicle of sharing the information and communicating and getting more awareness.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, Natalie.
Great, thank you. Danilo, how about for yourself and your organization? How do you see the relevancy of this study?
No, thank you very much. The study itself is actually complements in more details the work that we already done in terms of research work on land failure climate vulnerability. I'm really happy to note that especially with a lot of these case studies, it actually proves now and again that what we've done before is actually true, and we're heading towards this kind of, if you like, another catastrophe if we are not able to address issues around climate change and land tenure. It also supports the findings, the global findings of the IPCC on land, and the special report on land and climate. It's a huge document, and I think what ANGOC and partners did today is to actually provide a more, I would say, a more practical implications of those research, and actually put the smallholder farmers at the center of it. Not just because they are mostly affected, but because I think they can also contribute to address the climate change issues. From our perspective, GLTN, climate change is one of the thematic areas. GLTN aims to provide tenure security for all through, I would say, developing proper land tools. But for us to develop the appropriate land tools, we need to know what's happening. And I think that actually helps us, especially with this new study, help us to determine what kind of choices we need to make in the next few years in order to support the vulnerable poor, especially people in both informal settlements in urban areas, as also as UN Habitat mandate, but also in the rural areas, especially those people living as smallholder farming, but also in customary land or indigenous people's land areas. So this is really, really very useful for us. And I think our mandate is really to see the problem, see what others are doing, and actually find those gaps that potentially we can use or develop tools that can support both climate change action to ensure continuous tenure security of those people affected, but also on the other hand, how do land use or land tenure kind of tools and actions can actually support climate change adaptation and also further climate change action. Thank you.
Thank you, Danilo. Romy?
Yes, Natalia, I was hearing also Danilo, and it's really great to see such comments also on the importance of this linkage, in enhancing this linkage between climate change and tenure security. And exactly as our mandate is more on the knowledge management, I can tell you from the experience managing data and databases related to several issues on land, and land being a very cross-cutting issue. Of course, this goes also into land use data, this goes into climate data, this goes into gender data, and so on. And what I have been seeing is that, and also what I noticed from the report, is that climate data and land use data, degradation, these are all issues that are quite well documented, and maybe it's not by chance that this is still this is an issue that maybe is taken more seriously, because there is so much information available out there about it. But on the other hand, when we refer to land tenure security data, this is where a bit of the chaos starts. We see that in the space of land tenure security, data that is dispersed is fragmented. It is not really accessible. You have probably a lot of initiatives. Someone was, for example, one of the recommendations was about participatory mapping. This is generating data. And maybe there are thousands of initiatives out there collecting such information, this data, but it's not then being amplified and reaching at levels that you can make decisions that can really affect and bring positive benefits to communities. So this linkage between climate change and land tenure security, maybe the problem over there as well is because on one hand, you have a lot of information. On the other, this is fragmented, this is dispersed. And it's very interesting because in the report itself, I even made a few notes on when there are references that talks about particular sources, for example, about the frequency of intense climate events. And you have, for example, a very particular reference to the annual disaster statistical review reports. But right after that sentence, there is an information about in Bangladesh, almost 60% of the households are functionally landless households and own only 4.2% of the land. And precisely in that line, you don't see a clear reference to it. Where is this data coming from? So I think this is just a small example now to expose how we have perhaps an issue there to look at. Thanks.
Thank you, Romy. Yes, I think that struck out to me as well, and the statistic. And so GFAR provides this opportunity through collective action is to get disparate people that are working on the same topic to come together and discuss and share. And because often it's difficult to have a vehicle of communication, so the GFAR platform is built for such purpose. I would like to, I'm noticing the time, and I would like to make sure we have time to go into the breakout. So I don't want to cut off Romy and Danilo. Is there anything else you would like to comment on this paper, or shall we go into the breakouts? I do not want to cut you off. Anything you would like to add? Yes.
Yes, if I may just add, I think the awareness around the linkages between land tenure and the climate change, or even with land use. Land use is very much on climate change linkage, is very much known. The issue, and I think this paper is trying to build with also, of course, with our support, is to really put the center around land rights or land tenure recognition as a vehicle to address climate change adaptation. And this is not yet discussed even at the global level. It's very difficult even to discuss. It's very technical. It's very political in nature. So there's a need for that. Second, if you look at the funding around climate change adaptation, there's so much funding. But if you look at the way they also provided in terms of support, it's really more around, around emergency purposes, but also in terms of the after impact of the climate change. And very few funding is actually allocated in terms of providing tenure security or even trying to straighten out the land use problems. So that's a big issue globally. And we need a lot of advocacy and promotion and awareness and education around this. The third part, which probably I've not heard, maybe I'm wrong, and it's a very long talk of it also. We always talk about climate change impacts right after the where insecure people or poor people are mostly affected or affected disproportionately by climate change impacts. I think we need also to ensure that most of the time, government authorities or any other authorities, immediate steps after the event impacted by the climate change are always against the people that they think they are affected. So what I'm trying to say, for example, immediately after the floods around the riverbeds or around the coast, the immediate policy implication of the government, and they will impose, is that to have a more buffer zone. By just doing that, they actually providing more insecurity to the people that already been affected. So what I'm trying to say is, poor people, especially those insecure people, land insecure, are not just affected or because of their difficulty to recover. Most of the time, they are mostly affected and cannot recover because most of the solutions thought and implemented by the government authorities are actually providing more insecurity for them. And I think just want to emphasize this. I'm not really sure if this really been kind of captured within the study, but this needs to be actually emphasized, especially in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Danilo. Yes, those are good points. Francis has his hand up. Francis, did you want to respond to that? Go ahead. Francis from ANGOC.
It's not a response, but a comment or an observation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because after 47 years in this kind of work of development in agriculture and land rights, I am seeing more that as long as governments and their governance, they have a penchant for economic GNP, GDP, all these disasters caused by the destruction of nature, and the land rights and the tenure will always go back to the back burner. Just an observation. And maybe we should start facing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the video I find is very striking and would benefit from opportunities to be seen by more people. I'm seeing new hands. RJ, would you like to add something? And I'd like to go to the breakout so you have an opportunity to discuss in a smaller group, and then we can come back as a large group. Go ahead, RJ.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I don't have big points already covered by Danilo. So the point what Tony has made, that is the humanization of climate change discourse. Actually, we need to put into translate into action. And also Tony has mentioned that poor are the worst victims and last to recover. So I have a big question: do they recover at all? So they don't. They have a different life after that disaster, climate-induced disaster. And victims, we talk in a very general way, but that should not be, because victims are different. It affects different people, different way, the elderly, women, and the children who are the worst victim of. And immediate after any disaster, there is a big displacement from that area. So we always target about the victims. So for Bangladesh case, we have the experience of that. So we found that victims are not there, and there is no local record or data on that. So who are the victims, where they gone? So these are the issues need to be put at the center of humanization of climate change discourse. One is victim, and then intensity of victimization, like how it affects different people differently, and manifestations also. Once they migrate, men mainly migrate from rural to urban for different jobs, and the polygamy, multi-marriage, different issues are there that need to be covered and depicted. And the recovery, so do they recover, and what extent they recover, what life they have afterwards? It is the same one or different one? And they are the people, those who live on land and their livelihood is from land. So how much it is important, the land security, tenural security for them. These 3 points need to be put together. So, and under the humanization of climate change discourse, and definitely there must be right-based approach. So this is from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, RJ. Yes, what is the data collection on that? Who is creating interest? Who is tracking? Who is collecting stories? I think that storytelling evoke a lot. And so that's really an important piece. And, you know, this webinar is being recorded. And so it's an opportunity to also gain greater awareness. And so I'd like us to go into breakouts. I've set up some breakout rooms. And if you look in the chat, you will see the questions that we'd like you to discuss so that we can bring forward actions. So we've talked about the topics, we've brought up new points that we want to talk about. And so as Hildegard mentioned at the beginning, GFAR is co-hosting this webinar so that we can look at the possibility of doing a collective action on this. And so we've got 3 main questions for you, and I'll put them also once you're in the breakout. So 1, how do you see the impact of land rights on farmers' resilience to climate change? 2, how else can we raise awareness of the human impact, as RJ just mentioned, humanizing the impacts of climate change, how to give voice to those who are most affected? And 3, do you have more recommendations? I already asked you if you agreed with the recommendations. I asked you if you agreed with the linkages. So now do you agree with the recommendations? And would you have other recommendations? So please, when you go in your breakouts, if you could assign someone who will moderate these 3 questions and to capture some of your thoughts around these, so that when we come back, we're always tight on time. If you could put it in the chat so that it's at least captured. Okay, so I will send you out in the breakouts. You'll have 10-12 minutes to discuss, and I will put the questions again so that you're able to see them. So let me launch these rooms. Here you are. Have a good discussion. The rooms are open, and you should be getting the invitations now. Min, are you having difficulty joining the breakouts? I see Min and Bobo. Participants are in breakout rooms, and so they'll be coming back in a few seconds. Here we go. People are coming back. Welcome back. As people are coming back, thank you. I know the time was short. I hope you had an opportunity to get to some recommendations for ANGOC and GFAR for moving forward. So I'm just letting people are not everyone is back. So I'll just give them a few moments to get back into the main room. Those of you that are back, if you want to put anything in the chat, please go ahead. Okay, we're all back. Welcome back. I hope your discussions were fruitful. I'm sure you wanted more time, and I hope that this is just the beginning of this discussion of the linkages between land rights, climate change, and resiliency. And so I invite you to put your recommendations in the chat. And now I will open it up for the groups. I wonder if I invite room 1. So in room 1, we had Dawn, Vinod, Ripa, Tony, and Roel. Would you like to share some of your recommendations? A summary of what your discussion was about? We only have a few minutes, but I want to make sure that we open up the floor to everyone. So either room 1 or any other room.
Okay, thank you. From room 1, I would like to summarize the recommendations that we discussed in our we have, as you said earlier, we have 5 persons in our room: Roel, Don, Tony, Ripa, and Vinod, myself. Our recommendation for the study is we all agree in the study on the recommendation that presented at the beginning. In 4 recommendations, we all agree on the recommendations. But what we discussed, what we recommended here is definitely this study is not the in-depth study, and to make this more academic, we should also study on other additional. We need also on the other kind of better studies on how improving land tenure security impact sustainable land use. That's our one recommendation. Then another one is for the climate resilience land use practices. Definitely in coastal areas, the farmers are mostly high vulnerable in terms of the climate vulnerability, and for this we need to make aware them from different mechanisms like community radios, and there should be also equal participation of men and women, and women who are more involved in agricultural areas need to be aware, so that youth can be also mobilized for the awareness raising, information sharing. And another one is, as I said earlier, we can also, as a part of the academic study, we can also enlarge this study in future to make study more academic. And in general, we all agree in the recommendations that presented at the beginning. If I left anything, I would also request my team members to present here if any recommendation is missed here. Thank you.
Thank you, Binan. I am seeing some other recommendations in the chat, and please know that this will be captured. Are there other rooms who would like to share some of their thoughts with the group before we wrap up the webinar, which is just a start? Francis, you would like to speak? Yeah.
Yeah, room 4, we were not able to start from the very beginning because nobody was facilitating it. So
Okay.
we were able,
No one decided. Okay.
yeah, because we did not know who will facilitate. But anyway, on the last minute, I tried to ask them because it's only 1 more minute. So we just dealt with the last question. So everybody agreed with the recommendations, and nobody really precisely recommended more. But so I included my own input by saying be serious to include the CSO and farmers in global discourse as a representative to climate change, so that tenure can also be seen. And additional is to sharpen the link between tenure and climate change and further delve deeper into it and amplify the impacts for everybody, because we live in a world and land and soil and water is very vital to the survival of the human race and all of God's creation.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you for that. Yes, it's not easy when you're in a breakout room to decide who's going to speak. Hopefully we have more time next time. Denise, go ahead.
Yes, hello. I would just like to share some points made during the discussion by the second group, although of course we also did not have a lot of time to discuss. But generally we agreed that climate change impacts small farmers the most, especially during the growing season, and considering that monsoons and rains are becoming heavier. And essentially, for the landless, it is of course worse, because if you do not have land, you do not have rights. Nobody will even listen to you. The government will not even listen to you. And also, having tenure rights gives communities the power to decide on how to sustainably manage their resources. And of course, they will take care of land that is theirs to preserve their land for the future generation. And some of the recommendations that were provided for communities, for the communities we work with, we should encourage them to practice natural farming, to contribute less to the emissions. And civil society should also document farmer vulnerabilities and strengthen farmer resilience. Mapping climate vulnerabilities is important, and for government, it is also important to know the view of landless people and know the situation of communities within their villages, and also to provide land to the landless, pursue agrarian reforms, and also provide land to those who are made landless because of climate disasters. I think that would be all. For the members of my group, Bishwash, Rosalyn, Omar, if you have more, please provide your interventions in the chat.
Thank you very much, Denise. So we will be capturing everything that is in the chat. So if you do not have the opportunity to speak, as we are already at the end of our time, if you could please give us an additional 4 or 5 minutes so that we can wrap appropriately about what has happened. So Valeria, I will turn it over to you so you can talk to us a little bit about next steps and where we are going from this webinar.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. I had planned to say something about how collective action work, but luckily Hildegard covered this a little at the beginning of the webinar, the definition of what a collective action is. The idea was not to have a final idea about a collective action now. Of course, it was, as Hildegard said, to have the partners discuss and see if there was a common interest around this topic. And it seems that there is, from the discussions we've had. The focus, of course, each collective action has a specific focus. It's not just a generic topic. Of course, this topic is broad. That's another thing. The topic is broad, and the idea of a collective action is that it is action. So there has to be a focus on what people want to do together. if you agree and whoever among you agrees to bring the conversation forward can just contact us. We will send you a recording of this meeting. We will send you the minutes and we will ask for your feedback. And whoever is interested in bringing the conversation forward can just contact us, tell us, and we will have further discussions. I've seen different types of different priorities come up from the discussions, and some are shared. So I see common ground on bringing the conversation forward. You can just contact us.
Great, thank you. I'm launching a poll, and so if you want to, we will be able to capture now who wants to be involved. So this is one way for you to express your interest. You can reach out either to GFAR, to Valeria, or to Dawn. So I'm just launching this. Thank you very much. We've got 16 out of 16, so that'll be easy. We will be able to contact you. And I will hand it over to Dawn for some last words. And while we do this, I'm going to launch another poll for just your overall satisfaction from today's webinar. It's a very deep topic, and I think we had an opportunity to get a lot of knowledge, and would have loved more time for you to exchange. So over to you, Dawn, for some closing remarks.
Again, I would like to thank the Global Forum for Agricultural Research for partnering with ANGOC in organizing this webinar. And special thanks to Tony Kison and Marian for preparing for the video and the presentation, for trying to explain this, some really technical and concepts, putting the concepts into a more biteable or understandable to understand better these difficult concepts that we're grappling with. I also would like to thank Romy and Danny also for sharing their perspective, as well as to the ANGOC members, and also to Dato Herminio. If you remember in the presentation, one of the case mentioned was the payment for ecosystem, and Dato Herminio is an indigenous farmer in Bukidnon, and their organization involved in managing that reforestation in Magkalatungan. I think a major challenge really is that while the study gives us and there has been consensus in terms of the points raised in the study, is how to deliver that message to the key decision makers in the global discourse of climate change. So I think that's one area that we hope that GFAR can also partner with ANGOC in terms of engaging in these global processes and make sure that the message be heard in those discussions. And then the second point that also came clear is that while we have sort of, it seems that we have just touched the surface, and we need to document more experiences to illustrate and better explain the link of tenure and climate change. And I think the ANGOC network, where our members have partners, partner farmers organization, indigenous peoples, and fisherfolk communities, can work with GFAR in that direction. Yeah, I think the third point, I think that was mentioned, I think in the group, I'm not sure whether because of the audio difficulty, is that there's also to connect with the academe. And I think the GFAR network also has a number of academic institutions that can also further help us in trying to sort of demystify and explain further from the perspective of communities on how issues such as land rights are very critical in the discourse of climate change. Finally, thanks to Natalie and Valeria again for making this webinar possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you everyone for participating, for your interest. We hope that you will continue to gain awareness in your communities and in your networks. And so be on the lookout, as Valeria mentioned, for the minutes, for the recording, and for opportunities to participate in continuing this. So I wish you all a good end of day or beginning of your day, and look forward to continuing this discussion. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Good day.